Hello everyone, my name is Maxim. Today we'll be discussing the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. Kant is perhaps the most significant philosophical figure to emerge during the modern era of philosophy, and is worth covering for that reason. Let's begin with a brief summary of his biography. He was born in 1724 in Königsberg, Prussia, which is now Kaliningrad, Russia, and he was raised in a highly religious household. He occupied a number of academic positions, first as a private tutor, and later as a full professor, which he was appointed to the position of in 1770. Then he had what is called the Silent Decade, during which time he wrote the Critique of Pure Reason. He retreated from his social and professional life and focused almost exclusively on writing his most significant work of his career. And he emerged with the Critique of Pure Reason in 1781. He then made a number of amendments to that and summarized his arguments in a work called the Prolegomena. In his later life, he made a number of other philosophical contributions and passed away in 1804 in Königsberg. It's believed that he very rarely, if ever, left Königsberg, and he lived a very disciplined and rigid lifestyle over there. It was said that his neighbors would set their clocks whenever they would see him passing by their windows on his walk. That's how disciplined he was. So let's move on to his philosophy, and this is just a very basic outline. His philosophy is called Transcendental Idealism, and in it he argues that we can never know things as they are in themselves, only as they appear to us. This is a very simple way of putting it. And this is because our knowledge is limited by our own minds, which impose certain structures on reality. These structures are called the categories. So these are the categories of understanding, and there's 12 of them. We'll cover them all in detail in this lesson. And these are basic concepts that we use to make sense of the world. Concepts like cause, effect, space and time, substance, accident. Now, there are also the forms of sensibility. Kant identifies two forms of sensibility: space and time. These are the ways that we perceive the world, and without them, no perception would be possible. Kant also argued that a priori propositions need not necessarily be analytic. He argued that a priori knowledge can give us new information, or a priori judgments can give us new knowledge. And this is called the synthetic a priori argument. He posited, for instance, that mathematical judgments, mathematical equations, are examples of the synthetic a priori. We'll cover that as well. And in ethics, Kant argued that there is a moral law that is binding on all rational beings, and this is known as the categorical imperative, as opposed to, say, a hypothetical imperative, and it establishes a number of absolutes that apply to morality. Now let's discuss Kant's Metaphysics and Epistemology, which is called Transcendental Idealism. There's a few concepts worth understanding if you want to understand Kant properly. The first of these is called a priori versus a posteriori. So these are two concepts. A priori means prior to experience, that the knowledge of a certain, what's called a judgment, which is just a statement or claim of any kind, if it can be said to be true or false without having to look at the world, then that's an a priori proposition. If, however, you need to look at the world and see whether something is the case to establish the truth of the proposition, that proposition will then be a posteriori, meaning post-experience. You must look at experience first and then state whether or not it's true. So I'll give an example. If I say Maxim is teaching right now, that would be a posteriori, because you would have to look at the world to see whether or not it's true. Of course, by the time you're watching this video, I probably won't be teaching at that time, but if we look at this specific moment right now, it would be an a posteriori proposition, and it would, in this case, be true. Now, we also have a priori propositions, which are propositions such as 1 plus 2 equals 3. That's a priori because you don't have to look at the world to know that that is true. If you understand the meaning of the terms 1 plus 2 equals and 3, then you can see that it is true just by its own meaning. So that would be a priori. Now, it was previously believed, prior to Kant, that analytic judgments were all a priori and that synthetic judgments were all a posteriori. But Kant tries to divide this knowledge into two different sections so that you can have a synthetic a priori proposition. So analytic judgments are true by the nature of their very meaning. So for example, all bachelors are unmarried. And synthetic, where the predicate adds something new to our understanding of the subject, those require combining several concepts. So for instance, if I say all bachelors are unmarried, that is analytic because being unmarried is inherently part of being a bachelor. If, however, we say some bachelors are happy, that would require looking at the world and combining, so that would be the a posteriori aspect, having to look at the world, but the strictly synthetic aspect of that would be having to add something new, a new predicate to the subject, namely happiness would be the predicate and the subject would be bachelors. Now, in Kant's metaphysics, there's also the idea of phenomena and noumena. So the world is divided into phenomena, the things as we perceive them. That's the phenomenal world. It's made up of our phenomenons. And the noumenal world is the world as it really is, quote, in itself. So Kant uses this term, the thing in itself, versus the thing as it appears to us. And Kant argued that we can never truly know the noumena because our knowledge is always structured by our own cognitive faculties. In other words, when we receive data, it's filtered, and we'll get into that in more detail when we discuss the categories. And that takes us to the categories of understanding. So there are these 12 a priori concepts, meaning they don't come from experience, but we can figure them out logically. And these are concepts that the mind uses to make sense of any incoming data, form percepts that are intelligible to us, and this enables us to deal with the world. Nonetheless, we never get to know the world as it really is, only as it appears to us after it has been categorized. I'd also like to explain now why it's called Transcendental Idealism. I understood the idealism part when I first heard the name, but I didn't quite understand the transcendental part. So I looked it up, and it appears that transcendental refers to the exploration of the conditions necessary for human knowledge and experience. So what I believe it means is you are transcending experience to figure out these categories. While idealism emphasizes the primacy of ideas or consciousness in shaping reality. So if we give the primacy to ideas and consciousness, what is secondary to that? It's primary over what? And the answer is it's primary over reality. So Kant's whole metaphysics and epistemology functions on a primacy of consciousness premise as opposed to a primacy of existence premise. Namely the idea that our minds create reality, or at least our minds create the reality that we can ever understand, not that the reality is what it is and we gain direct access to that through our senses and our reason. So transcendental idealism asserts that our knowledge of the world is not solely based on direct sensory perception, but is structured through the active participation of our minds in organizing and interpreting sensory data. So this emphasizes subjectivity. It highlights the subjective nature of our perceptions, arguing that the mind's structures and concepts influence how we perceive and understand the external world. Now, one thing to note is that when we say the mind's concepts, the mind structures would be a more accurate representation of what the categories are, because concepts are abstractions derived from sense experience, at least if they are the kinds of concepts that require looking at the world. So for instance, a concept such as table would require looking at many instances of tables and then abstracting what they have in common, namely that they're man-made objects with a flat surface supported on something to make them higher than the ground. So that would be more or less the definition of a table. But that is a concept because it requires abstraction from sense experience. More than that, it's a posteriori concept. We would have to experience reality before we can derive such a concept. Whereas, for example, mathematical truths, Kant argues, are a priori. So it's not quite accurate to say that the categories are concepts, because they precede the whole process by which a concept is made. They shape our perceptions, but we'll get to that shortly. So, according to one interpretation of Kant, Kant is rejecting the existence of a mind-independent reality. So transcendental idealism challenges the notion that an objective reality can exist independently of human consciousness, and that reality is fundamentally shaped by our cognitive processes. This is called the one world interpretation, namely the idea that there is just this one world that our minds create. But there's also the two world interpretation, the sort of noumenal phenomenal distinction, which holds that the noumenal and the phenomenal are in effect separate. So there's the noumenal world, which we don't have any access to, and there is the phenomenal world. You could also say that there is the real noumenal world, but anything that happens in our heads, in as far as understanding the world goes, that would be phenomenal. So there are a few different ways to interpret Kant. So Kant distinguishes sensation from intuition, and this is another distinction that is worth understanding to understand Kant's philosophy. So sensation is the world having some effect on your sensory organs, your eyes, your ears, your nose, your sense of taste, and your sense of touch. So this represents the raw, unprocessed data which your mind receives from the environment. So for instance, you touch a hot stove, and that just that basic heat that's affecting your hand, that would be the sensation. This is before the data is processed. Now, if you've touched a hot stove, oftentimes you'll notice that you actually move your hand away before you're even conscious of what happened. That's because your nervous system is organized that way. But there is a distinction between sensation and then intuition. Intuition is effectively how that data is converted into something that is made intelligible to you, into a percept. So for instance, let's say you are looking at a dog. Now, your eyes are not telling you that is a dog. Your eyes are enabling the photons of light to come into your mind, right? Well, they touch the eye, and then they're somehow processed, and then that goes through a process first in the optical region of the brain, and then through some other mechanisms, some other neurological and psychological mechanisms, and then you arrive at the thought, that is a dog, right? Now, you're not conscious of anything up until you go, ah, yes, dog, whether you say it consciously or not. Once you recognize that that is a dog, you don't say, for instance, oh, there's a patch of a certain color, a certain distance from me, which seems to be moving in this general way. That's not how the mind works. You say, that is a dog. And so that understanding that that is a dog, that's an intuition, whereas sensation is just the basic data. And if there were no processing being done to this sensed data, then you wouldn't be able to make sense of anything that your eyes or any other sensory organ were giving you. So Kant defined intuition as the immediate, meaning automatic and unconscious, singular representation of an object. So intuition is what happens after this data has been categorized by these 12 categories. So the mind organizes these sensations into coherent perceptions of objects. So going back to the stove example, the organized perception of the object you are touching is a hot stove. That is an intuition. Now, intuitions further divide into two parts. There's quite a lot of concepts with Kant. That's why I chose to just do it two at a time. So according to Kant, intuition is the way we perceive objects. It's the direct, immediate representation of an object. And that is why we consider it pre-conscious. So everything that happens to that raw sense data as it's being integrated into a percept, you are blind to this. You don't know what exactly is happening. And Kant tries to explain what's happening. But he distinguishes between two types of intuitions: empirical, which is sensory intuition, and pure intuition. Now, sensory intuition, or empirical intuition, refers to the representations of objects that we get from our senses. So for instance, you see a tree and you immediately recognize that this is a tree. That's your sensory intuition. And it's derived from that sensory data. However, there are also pure intuitions, and these are space and time. So pure intuition is not derived from any particular sensory experience. Instead, it's a priori. It exists prior to and independent to any specific experience. And Kant argued that our minds have an inherent a priori understanding of space and time. And this understanding structures all our sensory experiences. In other words, even before we have any particular experiences, our mind already has a basic framework of space and time within which we can fit those experiences. Now, Kant gives a number of examples. For example, try to imagine a color without a shape, right? The shape would be, in effect, space. Try to imagine motion without time. Try to imagine something moving without a dimension of time. It doesn't make any sense. So he argues that if you didn't already have an understanding of what time is and of what space is, a sort of preconceptual understanding, if you didn't have an a priori basis on which to understand your experiences in the context of space and time, then you would never have made sense of anything. So you must have a knowledge of space and time in advance. So one additional way to look at this is you have the rationalists who hold that we have innate ideas and that we can deduce from these innate ideas or innate concepts, and we can arrive at certain, in effect, a priori truths. Alternatively, you have the empiricists who say, no, you're not born with any ideas automatically in your mind. Any ideas you get are shaped from ultimately your sense experience. But Kant takes a third position. He says, no, it's not as if we are born with any concrete knowledge. We are born with certain capacities and a certain machine that processes any knowledge we have. So we are born with a sort of basic understanding of space and time that is not quite an innate concept, but we also don't get it from sense experience. Now let's discuss the analytic-synthetic dichotomy, sometimes called the analytic-synthetic distinction. So, I briefly summarized this in the introduction, but I'll go into a little bit more detail now. Analytic judgments are statements where the predicate, the part of the statement that describes the subject, for example, a blue chair, the chair is the subject, the predicate is blue. So, when the predicate, the thing that is being ascribed to the subject, is already contained within the definition of the subject, that's an analytic judgment. In other words, the truth of the judgment is determined purely by the meanings of the terms involved. They don't tell us anything new about the world. So for example, if you say all bachelors are unmarried, the predicate unmarried is included in the definition of the subject, bachelor. You can't have a married bachelor, it's just a contradiction. So analytic judgments are tautological and their truth is known a priori independent of experience. Synthetic judgments. These are statements where the predicate adds new information about the subject that is not contained within the definition of the subject. So it gives you some kind of new information about the world. For example, the bachelor is unhappy is a synthetic judgment because unhappy is not part of the definition of bachelor. So the truth or the falsity of the statement depends on whether the bachelor in question is indeed unhappy, which would require, of course, if you wanted to verify whether this is true or false, you would have to look at the world as well. Now, Kant argues that it is possible to have a priori judgments that are also synthetic, meaning they don't require sense experience to be verified, and yet they add new information and give you knowledge of something that couldn't be gained just by looking at the description of the terms involved, at the definition of the terms involved. Now, if you look at the second proposition here, it's a mathematical proposition, and Kant's classification would actually not be analytic, it would be synthetic. That's a mistake on the slide. But the proposition is the sum of the angles in a triangle is 180 degrees. Now, of course, that's true, and it's mathematically true. You don't need to look at the world. And in fact, whether it's true or false can be understood if you know the meanings of the terms involved. So you could argue it's analytic. However, Kant says no, this is synthetic, because knowledge such as 180 degrees is not inherent in the definition of a triangle. So if the sum of all its angles are 180 degrees, that's not part of the definition. The definition would be, in effect, a closed three-sided shape, right? Three-sided, three-angled shape. And it's not the case that all of its properties can be inferred just by looking at the meaning of the term. So this is controversial, but Kant does in fact argue that this is a synthetic proposition. We also have a number of other propositions, and you can try to decide whether this would be synthetic or analytic. Some of these classifications may be incorrect. So for example, every event has a cause. Could be either way. It is wrong to lie. That's definitely synthetic. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Probably also synthetic. Every event has a cause. See, it's difficult to say. Can we just conceive of some uncaused event? Well, no. So then it seems true. But are we adding any new knowledge? That's the crucial distinction. And I think this is a major weakness for the whole analytic-synthetic dichotomy. And I disagree with the dichotomy. I don't think it makes any sense. But that's my view. And for now, we're just covering Kant's philosophy. Next, let's discuss the transcendental deduction of the categories. So, what does this mean? Well, Kant argues that the categories of the understanding are necessary conditions for the possibility of experience. In other words, without them, experience would be impossible. He does this by distinguishing two faculties. The faculties are sensibility and understanding. So, sensibility is the faculty of receiving impressions, which means the eyes, the ears, and so on. This is the ability to receive the data from the world, while understanding is the faculty of thinking. So the understanding processes the data received by the faculty of sensibility to convert it into something that a human mind can understand. And the categories of the understanding are concepts that we use to think about the objects that we perceive through sensibility. So Kant argues that the categories are necessary conditions for the possibility of experience, because they are the means by which we order and unify our sensations. So we integrate them into valid percepts. For example, the category of quantity allows us to order our sensations in terms of number and magnitude. The category of quality allows us to distinguish between sensations that are positive or negative, or between sensations that are real or imagined. So why can't we just not have the categories? Why can't we just perceive the raw data and have some intelligible framework automatically made for us without all of these categories? Well, Kant argues that without the categories, our sensations would be a jumble of meaningless data. We would not be able to make sense of the world around us. The categories, therefore, are essential to our ability to understand the world. What are the 12 categories? They actually divide into 4 sections: quantity, quality, relation, and modality. So under quantity, we have unity, plurality, and totality. Under quality, we have reality, negation, limitation. Under relation, we have inherence and subsistence, substance and accident, causality and effect, cause and effect, and community, reciprocity. And under modality, we have possibility, existence, and necessity. Now, to concretize how these categories actually structure perception, I have decided to use the example of watching a volcano erupt. So let's say you were watching a volcano erupt. How would Kant say these categories explain you making sense of this event? So let's begin with the categories of unity, plurality, and totality. These go under this subsection called quantity. So unity refers to perceiving the volcanic eruption as a single coherent event. So it's one, it's unitary, unity. Plurality is the opposite of unity, it means multiple. So we would understand the eruption in terms of many distinct elements: the ash, the lava, the smoke, the seismic activity, and so on. And totality would be understanding the eruption as a total event, including causes, effects, and all its constituent elements. Now, the quality categories. These include reality, negation, and limitation. So, the volcanic eruption is a real event. That's the category of reality. Negation refers to what is not real, what the event is not. So the eruption isn't a peaceful event. It's not controllable or predictable. That would be true of a volcanic eruption, at least insofar as our knowledge is concerned. Limitation refers to understanding the boundaries of the event, the size and duration of the eruption, the reach of the ash cloud, the limits of the damage caused. So nothing is unlimited. Otherwise, if something were unlimited, we would have nothing in contrast to it, so it wouldn't make any sense to us. So we must impose limitation on everything. Now, the relation categories are quite complicated. Cause and effect is the easiest to understand. We can understand the movement of the tectonic plates causing the eruption. But what about substance and accident? This would be the perception of the volcano itself, that's the substance, and the accident is what exists independently or that is happening, the state that the substance is in. In this case, the eruption is the accident and the volcano would be the substance. Community or reciprocity refers to the mutual interaction of things. The volcano eruption does not occur in isolation. It influences and is influenced by the environment, land, atmosphere, nearby communities, and this creates a web of interaction. So that's the reciprocation. And finally, the categories of modality are possibility, existence, and necessity. So possibility refers to the understanding that the volcano eruption is something that can possibly happen given the right conditions. In other words, potentiality. Existence, well, the perception of the eruption as an event tells us that it actually exists. And it's not just a theoretical or hypothetical event or potential event. And the category of necessity refers to understanding the eruption as a necessary consequence of certain geological conditions. Once these conditions are met, the eruption is not just possible but inevitable, so it's necessary, hence the category of necessity. So I have used the example of a volcano to explain how each of the 12 categories shapes your perception of this according to Kant. Now we're going to discuss Kant's ethics. I'd like to quote Kant on the purpose of morality. These are real quotes from Kant. Morality is not the doctrine of how we are to make ourselves happy, but of how we are to become worthy of happiness. The highest good is not the greatest happiness, but the highest morality. The next quotes are perhaps the most telling. Acting from duty is acting out of respect for the moral law, regardless of whether or not it leads to happiness. Acting in accordance with duty is acting in a way that is consistent with the moral law, but for reasons other than respect for the law. So he does draw this distinction between acting from duty, acting because you have the duty and you want to stay true to that, or acting in accordance with duty, which means just as a matter of coincidence, you acted in a manner that a dutiful person who were acting from duty would also have taken the same action, but you didn't do it for that reason. You did it for some other reason. And of course, Kant believes that acting from duty is far superior to acting in accordance with duty, even if the outcome is exactly the same and even if the action is the same. So mindset matters. The only thing that is good without qualification is a good will. So Kant believed that morality is not about achieving happiness, but about acting in a way that is morally good, according to his doctrine. He argued that the only thing that is good without qualification is a good will. A good will is a will that is motivated by duty, regardless of whether it leads to happiness or not. So I have given a few examples here of how conventional ethics, which is of course not one ethical system, but just most people's stance on various moral issues, would conflict with what Kant would argue. So let's take the first of these, the trolley problem. Now, Kant would argue that it is wrong to pull the lever because it would be actively killing one person. Conventional morality would argue that it is permissible to pull the lever because it would save 5 lives. So Kant is the ultimate duty ethicist, deontologist, meaning it's always right to do something and it's always wrong to do something else. The standard by which for that is called the Categorical Imperative, and it will appear in the next slide. But you must always act in accordance with the Categorical Imperative, regardless of the outcomes, regardless of the context. Lying to save a life. There's a very famous argument against Kant's ethics, because Kant says it's wrong to lie. No matter what, it's always categorically wrong to lie. So the famous example is, What if you were in World War II and you are sheltering Jews in your house and the Nazis knock on your door and ask you, are you hiding Jews? Now, you know, of course, that if you say yes, they will execute them and perhaps execute you. But Kant says, no, lying is always wrong. You have to be honest. You have to answer truthfully. It's always wrong. Whereas, of course, conventional morality would say, well, no, you should be honest, but only to honest people. This is a dishonest context, so I'm going to save the life and tell a lie because I have no obligation to be honest to Nazis. So the basic concept in Kant's ethics is the categorical imperative. And the categorical imperative states, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. I've put a photo of myself there because my name is Maxim. But a maxim is a principle of any kind. So act such that if everyone acted on the same principle that you are acting, that would not be a contradiction. So if it were made a universal law and everyone followed it, would that imply a contradiction in reality? So for example, why is it wrong to steal? Well, Kant says it's not wrong to steal because people have a right to their property or anything like that. The reason it's wrong to steal is because theft is only possible when property ownership is possible. For example, to steal, in order to steal, what you're stealing must belong to someone. If it doesn't belong to someone and you take it, it's not theft. For people to own things, they must have some sense of security in the knowledge that that is theirs. Otherwise, they would never take any action to acquire anything because the second they acquired it, it would be taken from them. So stealing requires property ownership. But if everyone were always stealing, no one would own any property, and then there would be nothing to steal. It would be a contradiction. And simply for that reason, it's wrong to steal. Notice that there is absolutely no mention here of the actual consequences of theft or of rights or anything like this. It's simply illogical if everyone were always stealing. Likewise, why is it always wrong to kill? Because if you kill everyone, then if everyone were to do that, eventually everyone would be dead and there would be no one to kill anyone. So that would also be contravening the categorical imperative. And that's really all it is. Now, what is the result of the categorical imperative? One of the implications is self-sacrifice. So it means that if there is ever a situation in which it's your life or acting in accordance with the categorical imperative, then you must act in accordance with the categorical imperative and sacrifice yourself. The other problem is that the categorical imperative allows for contradictory things to both be moral. For instance, when you wake up in the morning, have a cup of tea, or don't have a cup of tea. Both of those are universalizable. It's possible, if this were taken very seriously, for everyone to get a cup of tea in the morning. It would, of course, the tea industry would boom, and everyone would have access to tea, I think, if everyone took this seriously enough. It's a small enough and easily enough distributed resource that we could, in fact, get tea to everyone if it were really a categorical imperative in everyone's mind. So that would be universalizable. It would be possible to practice this consistently. But it would also be universalizable to say, never drink tea. Both of those conform to a categorical imperative. So which of those should you do? That's another problem with the categorical imperative. So there's no concrete guidance on what to actually do. But the biggest problem with the categorical imperative, which is linked, of course, to the issue of self-sacrifice, is that it neither considers the consequences of your actions nor the standard of your actions in the context of your own happiness. Because the standard is, could this be universalized? There's no reason given for why this is the standard. So in the end, we have a standard of morality which is opposed to one's own survival, flourishing, and happiness. So that concludes our class on Kant. I hope you enjoyed it. Next week, we will be covering Objectivism. Objectivism was developed in the 20th century by Ayn Rand. In metaphysics, Objectivism holds that reality is an objective absolute. In epistemology, Objectivism holds that reason is our means of gaining knowledge and our means of survival and flourishing. In ethics, Objectivism holds that we should be rationally self-interested and orient our lives towards our own happiness. In politics, Objectivism advocates free, laissez-faire capitalism. And in aesthetics, Objectivism extols romantic art. So we will be covering all this next week, and I will be uploading a lecture. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed.